Hi all, welcome to my channel. So in today's tutorial we are going to see how we can create a REST web service using Spring Boot and integrate that REST web service with a MySQL database in order to store and retrieve some data. And to integrate that with MySQL we are going to use SpringDataJpa. Okay, so the two main things which we will learning is how to create a REST web service using Spring Boot and how to use the SpringDataJpa to integrate with MySQL. So the main prerequisites, of course, like you need to have a version of Java installed, like either Java 8 or above, any version. You need to have an IDE of your choice for creating the Spring Boot application. So I am going to use Spring Tool Suite version 4. I am going to use that. You need to have a MySQL server running on your local. So I am as I am showing, like I am running this MySQL server, but running this MySQL server is out of scope of this video. If I will do a new video in order to show how you can run a MySQL server and create a table, you need to have an IDE to interact with the MySQL database. So this is the IDE which I use. This is called as HeyDSQL, and in that, like I have created a database and a table which I will be using in the Spring Boot application. Okay, so now I will get started. So in order to create a Spring Boot application, the Spring Tool Suite provides an option to use the Spring Starter project. So Spring Starter project is an initiative of Spring using which we can create the Spring Boot application, which internally uses a Maven archetype to create the application. Okay, so once we click on the create new Spring Starter project, it will give you an option to give the name for the project. So this is the name, like Spring. I have just given a name like Spring Boot Rest Web Service using JPA. I am using Maven in order to do the build, so it will create a pom.xml on its own. I am going to use Java version 8, and this is the group ID and artifact ID for creating the Maven archetype. So I am creating giving a sample group ID, and the artifact ID is same as the project name, and the version. So version I am just giving a snapshot version, and some description for the project. So I am going to create a Spring Boot REST Web Service with MySQL and SpringDataJpa. This is the initial package where it will create the Spring Boot application. Okay. Now we can select like what version of Spring Boot we need to use. I am using 2.7.7. Then we need to select the dependent libraries. So in our case, we need a Spring Web in order to create the REST Web Service. We need SpringDataJpa in order to interact with MySQL server. So this internally uses the Java persistence API. Okay, and then we use the MySQL driver in order to interact with our MySQL. Okay, so these are the three main dependencies which we need for this particular project. Then when I click on next, it will show like what URL it will execute in order to create the project. Then I just click on finish. When I click on finish, it will actually create the REST project. Okay, so it will show the progress here, how to create the REST project. So once you have created the REST project, it will show the complete project structure. So if I open the pom.xml first, it will show all the information of the project which we have created with the group ID, artifact ID and version which you have mentioned, and also it will add all the required dependencies, which will be the Spring Boot Starter Web, Spring Boot Starter Data JPA, and for MySQL we will have the MySQL connector. Okay, then it will create the sample project structure for this with the package which you have mentioned, and also the simple startup class in order for starting the Spring Boot application. Okay, it will also provide an application.properties where we need to mention all the required details to connect to our database. Okay, so to start with, first we will update the application.properties. In the application.properties, we need to mention our MySQL connector details in order to connect to our database. Okay. Okay, so in order to connect to the database, these are the properties which you need to mention. One is the data source URL. So if it is, since it is MySQL, we are using JDBC MySQL. This is the server, this is the local host, this is the port, and tutorial DB is the database which I have created using HeyDSQL. My database name is tutorial DB. So to mention the complete URL for that, I need to mention the data source username and password. And in order to create to the database, we need to mention which driver we need to use. Since it is MySQL, we need to use the MySQL driver. This will come from the MySQL dependency which we have created. Okay, and also we need to mention the dialect for that. Since we are using JPA in order to interact with our database, we are adding a dialect, MySQL dialect. Okay, so these are the properties which we need to mention in order to connect to our database. Okay, the starting step for that is we need to create an entity class, right? So if you are familiar with Java Persistence API, in Java Persistence API we create something called as an entity, which is the synonym of whatever is the database tables we have. Same thing we need to create here. We need to create an entity class which will be the replica of our database table. Okay, so for that I am just creating one package called as entity, and within the entity package, like I am creating an entity class. So I am naming that as student entity, because in my table is student table, so I have to interact with the student table. So I am creating an entity by the name of student. Okay, so once we have created the class, I need to inform Spring Boot that this is an entity class. In order to inform Spring Boot, we have an annotation called as entity. Okay, so once I add that entity annotation, which is from a which is from the JavaX Persistence API, which is from the JPA class, JavaX Persistence entity. So we have to just mention that the student class is of type entity. Okay, once I have mentioned that, I have to mention which table this student class will be linked to. So I have to add a table annotation, and in that I just need to give the name as student. So this means that this particular student entity class maps to the student table in our tutorial DB. Okay, this again we need to import JavaX Persistence table. Once I have created the entity class, now we need to mention what all are the columns in that particular table, right? So in our table, if you see, we have 3 columns. One is the ID, name and age. So same thing we need to create in our entity class as well. So I am creating called as ID, I am creating name, age. Okay, so ID will be of type long. Okay, and this ID, if you see in the table, we have mentioned the ID as the primary key and auto increment. So the same thing we need to mention in our entity class also. This will be the ID field. Again we have to import JavaX Persistence ID. Similarly, I need to mention like this is the sequence value, right? So because here again, if you see, right, if you see, this is the primary key and auto increment. The same thing I need to mention in my entity class as well. Okay, so for that we need to again give an annotation for my ID. Okay, so we have to give the @generated value because it is auto generated. Okay, so we have to again import the JavaX Persistence generated value. We need to mention a strategy for that. So in our case, strategy is t dot okay, so in the strategy I need to mention strategy is equal to generation type dot identity. Okay, so this will use the primary key which is mentioned in the database directly. That's why we are using generation type dot identity here. Okay, so once that is done, I just need to create the getter setter for all these methods. So I'm just going to create the getter and setter, just create those getter setter for all these fields added in the student entity. So once the entity class is created, so next step will be we need to create the repository class which is actually used to interact with the database by using the entity class. For creating the repository, again I am creating one separate package called as repo, and inside that I am going to create a interface called as student repository. Okay, so since we are going to use SpringDataJpa, we don't need to do any implementation. We just need to create an interface which actually extends from the SpringDataJpa class called as CRUD repository. Okay, so this CRUD repository is a class which is already Okay, so this CRUD repository is a class which is already present in SpringDataJpa, right? So this is from the Spring Data, so we just need to import that. So once I imported that, it is showing a warning, right? So what it says is CRUD repository is a raw type, and we need to mention the generics for that. So it accepts two parameters, one is the type and another is the ID field. So in our case, this is of type entity student and our ID is of type long. So we need to mention those two fields. Okay. So as I mentioned, like since we are using SpringDataJpa, I don't need to provide any implementation for this. Okay, we just need to import the CRUD repository, and as the name suggests, this class has its own implementation for all the inbuilt methods like saving an entity, finding an entity. So if I open that CRUD repository, right, so it already has the save method, save all method, find by ID, find all. So these are the inbuilt methods which we will be directly using. So we don't need to find and add any implementation for that. But if we need to create any specific methods, then we need to add the method names here. So I will come to that later in this tutorial, where we need to add one extra method. For now we will not add, we are not going to add any new methods. Okay. So once the repository is created, next step is in order to integrate with the repository, we are going to follow the same pattern which we use in a service layer pattern or MVC design pattern, where we will have a service layer which will actually integrate with the repository. Okay, so before that, one step we forget is we need to inform Springboot that this is a repository class. So for that, we need to annotate that with the repository annotation. Okay, this is again from the Spring stereotype package. We have to mention that it's a repository. Okay, now to interact with the repository class, we are creating another class called as a service class. So I'm creating a service package. Inside that I am creating a service class. So again I am creating student service, and here again, like first step itself, I am informing Spring it is a service class. Okay, great. And the rate service, I'm just adding that annotation. Okay, so as I mentioned, the service class will be interacting with the repository class. So for that we need to auto over the repository class. I'm just auto overing the student repository here. So I'm just auto overing that. Now we are going to create the different methods which we need in the service class, right? So in our case, what we need is we need to create an entity, we need to read the entity, and then if I want to give an ID, then I need to retrieve the entity by an ID. So first step is we will have to save the student object. Okay, so for that what we'll do is we'll create a method which will actually save the student object. So public student save student, it will accept an object of student again, and its return type also for now I kept it as student object itself. Okay, so what this will do is this method will accept a student object, it will call our repository class in order to save that student. In the repository we have a method called as save, it will pass the student object into the repository class and save the student. The return type for this save method, if you see, that is also again a student object. So what internally it will happen is when we get a student object with name and age, it will save that student object, it will generate an ID on its own, and with that ID it will return another student object, right? And that student object we can return back. Okay, so once it is saved, we need the ID of the student object, that's why we are returning the same object again with the ID field. Okay, so this is to save the student object. So here as you see, we are not doing any logic in order to do an insert into the table. We are directly using the save method in the SpringDataJpa. Okay. So once I have saved it, next step will be like, for example, like if I want to retrieve all the students, right? So if I want to retrieve all the students, it is like a list of student. Okay, we'll another method like get all students. Okay, so all the students which are there in the database, if I want to retrieve. Okay, so now I just need to import the list. I'm importing the list. So for that again, there is an inbuilt method find all. Okay, right. So if you see, this is a find all method which is used to retrieve all the student. Okay, so I'll just call the find all method, and if when you saw that, the find all method is actually returning a type of iterable student. So we just need to convert that into list of students in our case. So what I'll do is I'll just return the same thing after converting it into list of students. Okay, so in all this is to get all the students. But now, for example, like you just want to get one student based on the ID, right? So then we will have a method find student by ID, and then the input will be the ID field. Okay, here again I will call the same student repository, and again as we saw earlier, right, there's a method find by ID. So in the find by ID, I will pass the ID field, and when we see the find by ID method, it will return something called as optional student. So for example, if you search based on an ID, you may or may not find a record with that ID field. That's why it is returning something called as optional, if you are familiar with optional in Java 8, right? But we just want to return the student object. So what we'll do is, if we don't find any record, we will just return null. If we find it, we will return that particular student. So we will use or else, so that returns the value if present, otherwise it will return whatever is mentioned in the other, which is null value. Okay, so if the student is present for that particular ID, it will return the student object, else it will return null. Now I will create one more method. So till now we have used all the inbuilt methods. So when we created the student repository, we mentioned, right, we will create our own method within the student repository interface. So for that, for example, if I want to search a student based on a name, right, so inbuilt there is no method to search based on the name. So for that, what we will do is we will create another method in the interface which will actually return list of student find by name, and it will accept the name parameter. Okay, so what this will do internally is, in the student entity we have a field called as name, right? So whatever we mention in the find by name, so if it is find by ID, it will search on the ID. If it is find by name, in the student entity it will search on the name field by passing whatever is the parameter which we are passing here. So we don't need to write any implementation for this. This is just like an abstract method. We just need to create that method in the interface find by name by passing the name parameter. Now in the student service again, I will create a similar method, right, which will return list of student find student by name, and it will accept the name parameter. So what it will return is again similar thing, right, student repository dot find by name by passing the name parameter. Okay, so now we have created like 4 methods here, like which we want to interact with our database, like to save, to get all students, to find a student by ID, to find a student by name. Okay, so now we have created the service class. Now I need to expose these functionalities as a Rest web service. In order to expose these functionalities as a Rest web service, we have to create a controller class now. Okay, so in order to expose this as a Rest web service, we have to create a Rest controller. Okay, so for that again, like I am creating another package called as controller, and inside that I am creating a Rest controller class. So I am naming that as student controller. So again, like as we have mentioned as rep service and repository, here also I need to mention something called as REST controller annotation to mention Spring that this is the controller class. Okay, and since this is controller class is be exposed as a REST web service, we need to have a path exposed. Right? So for that we need to mention a request mapping here. For example, any URL which comes as /student will be redirected to the student controller. Now in the student controller, same as service, I am going to expose the methods. Right? So first method is again we need to mention something called as for the saving the student. Okay. So for the REST, since this is a REST controller, any method will return something called as a response entity. Okay. For the save method, this response entity will be of type student. Okay. So we will call save student, and it needs to accept some parameters. Right. So before that, I'll just import these two. So it needs to accept some parameter. The parameter this needs to accept will be part of the request body. And so we have the request body annotation. So it will again accept a student object itself. Right. So I will mention it will accept a request body of type student. Okay. Now since this is a create method, right? Since this is a create method, we use something called as a post mapping. So if you are familiar with REST web service, we have different methods for REST, right? One is the post method, and if you see this corresponds to a request mapping method equal to post. So we have post, we have put, we have get, we have delete, etc. Right? So since this is a save, we are creating it as a post mapping. Now the student controller need to interact with the service class, right? So for that now we need to auto over the service class here. Service. Okay, so I have auto word this service class here, student service. Let's copy paste its name. Auto word this. Now from this method we need to call the student service dot save student by passing the student object. So and the response type is again student created student to this. Okay. Now we need to convert that into a response entity, right, for our REST web service. So for that what we'll do is response entity dot, then we need to mention what is the status for that, right? So only if it is, in our case we are treating it as success, so we will mention the status as okay, and the response body, right? So in the body I need to mention created student. Okay, so what this will do is it will call the student service, save the student, whatever is the response which we get, we are converting the response back into a response entity class. In the response entity we have to mention what is the HTTP status in this case. In this case HTTP status is 200, which corresponds to OK, and the body of the response will be whatever is the new student which is created. Okay, now same way I will create another method in order to retrieve all the students created. Okay, that will again be of response entity, but now instead of student it will be list of student. Okay, so it will again be find all students. So in this case there is no parameter required for this, and since this is to get all the students, this will be of type get mapping. Okay, so I'm just adding the imports. Again from here I am just calling student service dot get all student method. Okay. So this will be again of type list of students, right? Students equal to Okay, so in this case we have two possibility of a response. One is students can be present or may not be present, right? So based on that we can return two different response entity. So if, for example, like if a student is present, then it will be of status okay. If student is not present, then it is of status empty, right? So it will be, we will mention that as no content. Okay, so I'll show you that. So for example, like this is the case where student is present. If null is not equal to student and student is not empty, we are returning the HTTP status as okay with the student's object. If it is not present, what we'll do is we'll return HTTP status as no content, and our body will be empty. Okay, so this way we can return multiple response entity status based on our scenarios. Okay, so if it is present, it will be okay. If it is not present, it will be no content. Okay, this is to retrieve all the students. Now I am going to expose another method to search the student based on an ID, right? So that will again like similar to this. I am just copy pasting this. Now instead of find all students, it will be find student by ID, and instead of list of students, it is just one single student, right? Since it is based on an ID. Okay, so this is also a get class. Okay. So now here I need to get an ID field as an input, right? So I need to add a mapping for that. So since this is a parameter, we are enclosing that within the curly braces. Okay, so here I need to mention this is an ID field, and whatever is coming in the ID field, we call that as a path variable. Okay, so I need to add a path variable annotation which mentions that I am getting the ID field here. Okay, so here we are just adding the @path variable, and whatever is the path variable which will come, it will get assigned to the ID variable here. Okay, so now again we are doing the same thing here. I'm just copy pasting that and making like small modifications. Okay, so here now instead of list, it will be just single student, right? So student service dot, instead of get all, it will be find student by ID by passing the ID field. So here again same thing. If null is not equal to student, for example, same thing can happen, right? If a student is present, we need to return okay. If student is not present, we need to return null. Okay, so that is the modification, same as the last method. If student is present, we will return student, else we will return no content. Okay, now we will expose one more method in order to retrieve the student based on the name, right? So in that case, what we'll do is we will add one more URL. So till now all these are using the same path /student. For name, for example, like I am adding some extra path, for example student/name, and the name attribute, instead of path variable, what we can do is we can get the name attribute as a request parameter. Okay, so we have something called as request param string name. Okay, just importing the request param. So now in this case it should return again a list of students, right? Because there can be like multiple students with the same name. So it will be a list of students, and again from here we are calling find student by name method by passing the name, and again like instead of student it will be list of student, and I will just renaming it as students in both the place, and here also again we need an empty check since it is a list. Okay, not only if it is not empty, then we will return this. Okay, so this is another method which accepts a request parameter. I will show the difference between request parameter and the path variable when we test this API. Okay, so now we have created a controller class. We have exposed the save method, which is a post. We have exposed 3 get methods. One is to retrieve everything, another is to retrieve based on a path variable ID, another is to retrieve based on a request parameter name. Okay. Now I will just try to run the application. Okay. So I'll just run as Springboot app. Okay, I'll show the output here. So once you start the application, like Springboot will connect. So here it's actually connecting to our MySQL database. Okay, once it's connected to the MySQL database, the Tomcat. So Springboot application internally runs a Tomcat web server, and the application is started on the Tomcat port 8080. So now our application is now started on 8080 port. Okay. So in order, since this is a Rest web service, there is no UI page. So in order to test that, we need something called as a Postman or any Rest web service client. So first we will create a resource to test it. For example, if I will just do localhost 8080/student get method in order to check whether the API is running or not. So it shows 204 no content means there are no student object created yet. And now we will try to create a student object using the post mapping. Okay, so this is accepting a JSON. So I will mention a JSON field with the name and age. Right, these are the two fields which we have created in our entity. So I will just add these two fields here and invoke the student resource as post. Okay, now once you run this, we are getting a status 200 OK. I have created an object with ID as 1. Now if I go back to my database and do select star from student, it would have created that particular record in the database. It would have generated an ID, right, and the generated ID we see in the response. Now if I try to create a new record, for example, right, the age is 21, then it will give the ID as 2. It will auto generate the ID here. If I go back to the student table, I will be able to see the second record. Okay, now if I come back to this method, so this method is to retrieve all the students. So now if I click on send, here in the output you will see all the student records which are created as a list. So this is a list which has all the student object, and now the status is 200. Okay, same way if I just want to retrieve one student, right, there we pass the path parameter, right. So here we mentioned that, right, if you remember, we have mentioned something called as the path variable here as ID. So to invoke this by passing the path variable, this is the syntax. We just pass the ID field as one of the path variable. So we just /1, it will retrieve that particular record. If I go to, it will retrieve the second record. If I give some, and here if you see the status is 200. If I give something which is not present, it will show 204 no content, and the body will be empty. Okay, same way now if I want to invoke by passing the name. So for that, if you see, we have to pass one more path as name /name, and then I need to pass the request parameter. So this is how you pass the request parameter. So path variable, you don't need to mention ID, you just mention the ID value. You don't need to mention ID equal to. But if it's a request parameter, we need to mention name equal to and the value for that. If I click on this, it will return whichever name has PG, right? And if similarly, like again, yes. And if I want to create one more name with PG, for instance, right? So it will create with 3. In the database also you will see one more entry, and here if I now pass G, it will return both the entries as a list. And if I pass something which is not present, it will show 204 no content. Okay, so this is how we basically create a REST web service using Spring Boot and integrate that with MySQL database using SpringDataJpa. So just a recap. First we have to create a new web service using Spring Starter project, and we need to select the required dependencies for that. In our case, we need Springboot starter web, we need Springboot starter data JPA, we use the MySQL connector. Then all the connection parameters for the database we need to mention in the application.properties. After that, we need to create the entity class which maps to our database table. Then to interact with the database, we need to create a repository class which extends the CRUD repository. And if you want any custom methods, you need to add the custom methods here. Then we create a service class if we want to have any business logic here. In our case, we have not added in business logic, but if any business logic required, we need to create a service class. Then we create a REST controller class in order to expose this functionality as a REST web service. So in that, we can use the post mapping, we can use the request body annotation, we will use the get mapping, we will use the path variable, and we will use the request parameter annotations. Okay, so this is the high level how you will create a REST web service and use the SpringDataJpa. Hope you all like this. So if you liked it, and just share the link and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.